Good morning. I always say good morning, just checking if you're awake. My name is Danny Stevens. Welcome to this presentation. First of all, I'd like to invite you to join Slido and engage with Q&A or any questions you might have or suggestions. There will be 2 polls also in the presentation. And one question I'd like to point at you is, how are you organizing your event technology today? Do you use like one provider, an all-in-one solution, or do you try combining multiple tools and technology that's out there and bring them together? Or do you don't use any technology at all? That's one question I'd like you to shoot this way. Okay, there's one brave one. 3 brave ones. Interesting. Good morning, join in. So the question is, how do you organize your event technology stack today? Do you use multiple providers to service your event, or do you just have a all-in-one solution, providing all the technology like mobile apps, networking, registration, all with one company, or are you combining multiple solutions, best of breed? Okay. Pretty heads up there. Oh. Okay, so throughout the years that we've been organizing events and event technology, and it's been, given my gray hairs, it's been a few years now, we've tried to come up with some rules on what can technology bring or deliver to your event, and what are the pitfalls and the advantages and the benefits you should look for. So I try to compress this in 6 basic rules you can use on any event technology you're going to be using. And the first one is, make sure you define the objectives. What are you going to use the technology for? What value is it bringing for your event? And one example I always give is, must have been like 5-6 years ago at the Brussels Motor Show, we had a integration and interaction with a car manufacturer, and they had NFC tags on the wristband, and you could actually log into the kiosk and then define what car you were going to buy, what your current car was, and so on. And we had 8,000 qualified leads combined over 4 brands. We went to see them 3 months later. What have you done with the data? And they go, well, actually nothing, because we don't have the resources to follow it up. That's about the worst example you can have of adopting technology. And you often see that companies are adopting technology because it's cool, because it's great, but think about the objective first. Think about the value it's going to deliver, and put the delegate in the first place. Because if your delegate is not going to adopt your technology, then there's no value. If you have an awesome mobile app but there's no engagement, it doesn't deliver any value, not for you or not for the delegate. So make sure that you have a battle plan. So don't buy a cannon to kill a mosquito. If you're okay with clickers at the door to know how many people were in, and that serves your purpose, go with the clickers. Don't invest in RFID or NFC technology or facial recognition or any other technology you can use. Define the objectives, see where it can deliver value for any stakeholder in the event, and set up a clear game plan. Not only what you're going to do during the event, but also how am I going to use this data after the event. That's one basic rule. The second one is integrate. Any event tool or any app out there that does not talk to the rest of the data stack is basically worthless, because you're going to end up with multiple sources of information which are uncombinable after. So make sure that you have one single source of truth for your data. It can be the registration platform, it can be your marketing platform, but make sure that the data integrates and that flows from one application to the other. So if you're using a different provider for your registration, you have your data in your CRM or your marketing tool, in Salesforce, wherever, the data is going to flow into the registration, and then it needs to go on site. How are we going to do the badging? How are we going to organize the matchmaking? How are we going to provide the mobile app? So this data moves from one application to another. And there's two main choices there. Actually, there's three. There's no technology. I'm happy there was nobody using no technology. Or you can start combining providers. But don't let you be misled by the fact that a provider says like, oh, we have an API. Yeah, right. An API is not an API. Manage the expectations of what you want the data to do for you. How do you want them to behave? Because if one thing can mess up your event, it's an API integration. Data not flowing through, badges with the wrong data on it, information that flows into your mobile app that's irrelevant. So make sure that you have a clear goal plan, a clear plan on how the data is going to move from one application to the other, and define one single source of truth. Don't start with Excel and we have some data in the mobile app and people can also register themselves as a delegate in the mobile app. Make sure that that data flows through and that you have one single source of truth, and that is your main data stack. And then do not assume that the API is going to take care of it. Set up the goal plan, work it out, and test it. Retest it, and retest it. And go to the bottom. Make sure, how does a delegate behave? Go in the mindset of a delegate. What's happening? I'm working up to the registration. I haven't registered. Work out the scenario. Where does the data come in? Where does it go to? How does it move? And how does it come out in the reporting afterwards? The third one, play by the rules. GDPR is here to stay. And we've seen there's a number of things you have to do basically to comply, and it's basically three simple things. First of all, it's consent. Make sure that you have consent of the delegate. That's the data flow of, for instance, of facial recognition. It looks complicated, and it also is. Technically, it's complicated, but actually it's basically very simple. Get consent of your delegate. So that means opting in. During the registration, you get a question, do you want to opt in for facial recognition? Do you want to opt in? How is the data going to be used? And get consent from the delegate on how the data is going to be used. And make sure that you have data retention policy. Data should be removed the latest 2 weeks after the event or anonymized. So get consent, tell them what you're going to do with the data, and make sure you comply to data retention. And then we've implemented a lot of things for the on-site behavior of the kiosk. And basically what you should do is, when you have a hostess at a kiosk delivering badges, anyone that integrates with your data, whether it's a matchmaking or a networking tool, everybody that has access to the data should be identifiable, which means that you have a hostess at a kiosk. She sees the data, she sees the list of delegates, so she should be identified as the one having access at that specific point to the data. What that means in the real life is that you should give your hostess a badge. She needs to scan in and then start logging in and managing delegates. In the real life, how does it work? The hostess walks off with her badge, she goes to the toilet, powder her nose, there's nobody at the kiosk is locked, the data needs to be encrypted, and at the end of the day you see that GDPR is implying a lot of rules which are not manageable in the real world, because it's slowing down the process. You would need 3 times as much equipment to serve the same event. So make sure that when you interact with a client that you define what is feasible and what is workable in an event. And there's rules and there's like the gray zone. In the real life we noticed that being 100% compliant with GDPR, it's possible, but it's got an impact on the staff and on the tools and on the equipment you need, because you need to comply to all these rules and regulations. So what we did, we spent like 8 months developing all the GDPR implications, and then we spent another 2 weeks to implement a button where you can just switch it all off. That's the real life. So adding, for instance, for facial recognition, this is a good example of how biometrics data is used in an event. Basically what you do is you opt in, so you ask the question, do you want to opt in for facial recognition? You say yes, you get a confirmation email, you upload your photo, but it's important that the image and that the biometrics is on a different location than your customer data. So basically you have your registration system, you have the opt-in for the facial recognition. This creates an array of numbers and the photo itself is deleted. So you have two data sources only connected by the customer ID in between the two databases. So even when there would be a hack on the facial recognition server, there's no data there. There's just numbers, an array, and an ID in the database. And the actual matching of the data happens on the kiosk. So you walk up to the kiosk, the camera recognizes you, talks to the server, gets an ID back, and then prints out the badge. That's how the whole process works. So make sure, certainly if you're working with biometrics data, and making sure that you play by the rules there. Added value is key. Look for value. What is it going to bring? What is the added value for every stakeholder in your event? For you as an organizer, it's clear. When you start collecting data, it's gold. Knowing where the delegates are, how they behave, who they are visiting, which kiosks they are going to, which sessions they are going to, who they are meeting up, that's valuable data for you as an organizer. But if the delegate doesn't adopt your technology, like you might have a great mobile app, but which serves networking, but then you have to switch on your Bluetooth and you have to have your location activated, and then by 2 o'clock in the afternoon your battery will be dead because it's draining your battery. So if there's no adoption of the delegate and there's no use for the delegate, then there's no adoption and there's no value. So make sure that you put the delegate first. For instance, for facial recognition, what could be an advantage for the delegate? How would we sell that to the delegate? Speed up the process. So that's a value, a clear value. How do we implement that in real life? Well, the first pilots we did, we had about 40% of the delegates opting in for facial recognition. So we had a separate queue for facial recognition. People are queuing with their barcode, and the other queue is without barcode facial recognition. And you see the queue with the facial recognition going twice as fast. So I want to go there. No. Next time. You make sure that you slow down the other ones a bit, and the next time, and we see that actually the adoption is growing. For the same client, we did 4 events in a row, and the adoption rate was actually growing from 46 to 87% on an event of nearly 20,000 delegates. So it's also about changing behavior. Remember the first events you did when you had no barcode and you had to look at everybody, or you had to, and then you start implementing barcodes, and people are, oh, I don't have a barcode. What's a barcode? And what's a QR code? And so it's just adoption. And as we see, facial recognition is becoming more common on airports, on your mobile devices. So it's getting more and more adopted and getting adopted by the delegates. And look for value for any other stakeholder in your event. What's the advantage of using lead retrieval for your exhibitors? What's the advantage of knowing who is in this session? Why are you being scanned? Because I am, as a speaker, I'm going to spam you afterwards with all my promotional mail. So that's where the value is for me as a speaker. I'm not going to do that, sorry. So look for the delegates' value, look for the exhibitors' value, look for the value of the different stakeholders in your event. Technology also creates opportunities. There's a cost, but it's also creating new opportunities for monetization. So they say like, oh, well, it's expensive to print full color badges, but think about what you can do and how you can monetize that technology to generate more revenue for your event. So this case, for instance, is badgevertising. We can do targeted advertising live printed on the backside of the badge. So by target group or even on an individual basis, we can start launching advertising campaigns to a specific group or to a specific individual of delegates. So this creates 5 times more value than you would sell the backside of a badge as an advertising. So it's a revenue opportunity which can actually balance out the extra cost of using technology. Facial recognition, there's a cost. But by the fact that you're working faster, you need less staff, you need less equipment, less logistics, less shipping. So actually it's balancing out. So don't only look at the cost, also look at the extra value you can create and calculate the real cost of technology, which means that by adding technology, you might save on staff on site. And one of the answers we often get, yeah, but the staff is already there, it's being paid. No, it's a cost. It's not because it's your own staff that's on site. That's writing the badges or printing them up front. Calculate the time that your staff needs to print those badges up front, put them in envelopes, put them on trays, and lay that off against the cost of your using live badging, for instance. So look at the value of technology and where it can add value there. So in terms of the facial recognition, coming back to that, just a script of the process. It can be any platform, Eventbrite, Aventry, Cvent, whatever. There's a question, registration form. The question is, do you opt in for facial recognition? And yes, what are we going to do with the data? You get a barcode as a backup. You get a direct link, and when you click on the link to upload your photo, it will pop you up a page where you can actually take a selfie, upload a photo, and then you get a quote. So we're actually going to look at the photo up front and see if it's usable for facial recognition. And you get a score. I got 8. No, 8.5. I never got 8.5 in school. More like 6s. So it's actually evaluating the photo, and then when you walk up to the kiosk, it will recognize you, pop up your name, your identity, you confirm, and then the badge is printed. So you don't need any documents. And why did we implement this? Exactly because it's not the printing speed that defines the flow of the delegates, it's the whole process around it. And what is slowing down the most? It's the social interaction and the unmindfulness of the delegates, I would say. So walking up to the kiosk, like, oh yeah, I need a barcode. Wait, where's my phone? Wait, flipping it around, putting the brightness up. That's what's slowing down. It's not the printing of the badge actually that slows down the delegate. It's the whole interaction of the delegate. So make sure that you control the whole process. It's great to have awesome fast printing printers, but if you don't manage the process of the people walking up to the kiosk and making sure that they have the barcode, so the queue management, take those lanyards away from the kiosk. There's no use in having a kiosk that can print 6 seconds per batch, and then you need another 15 seconds to clip on the lanyard. It doesn't make any sense because it's blocking your equipment. So think about the whole process and think about how it can create value for your delegates. And then delegate behavior can be measured in different ways, knowing where people are. There's different technologies to do that. Facial recognition could be one of them. It could be NFC, RFID. Anyone not familiar with the terms RFID, NFC, beacons? Maybe quickly. NFC is a technology near field communication where you actually have to touch. So you have a card, you have a tag, you have a wristband, and you have to opt in or touch a point, and it can measure where specific delegates have been at a specific point. RFID is based on, it's got a high accuracy, but it slows down the delegate because you have to stop, check in, and then move on. RFID is a different way to do it. It's actually antennas. There's a little tag in the badge which is linked to your name, and the antenna reflects on the badge, sends back the signal and says like, I think there's about 432 people here, and these and these and these have opted in, so I know their identity. Problem is that if you wear an RFID tag under your phone, or you have multiple people walking into the room, the accuracy is not as good as NFC technology, or even not as good as barcode. So again, define your objectives. Do you need this to have heat maps and to know the behavior? Like in a festival, you roughly know where the crowd is going? Or do you want to know exactly who is entering this session and who is walking out and how long they have stayed? That's 2 different objectives. So the technology needs to be adapted to what you want to achieve with the objective. Rule number 5. Dare to experiment. We as technology providers, we cannot advance if we don't find companies that are willing to jump in the bath with us and have a backup plan. Plan B, plan C, plan D. I remember the first years we did live batch printing. We actually had the trays with the pre-printed batch in the back to make sure if something goes wrong with the computers, then we can still pull out the trace, and then people get more confident and say, oh, this is working, this is actually adding value, and then the trace disappeared, but actually there was a double cost. So make sure you have a backup plan. If you introduce new technology, whether it's facial recognition, virtual assistants, networking tools, whatever you're introducing, make sure you have a plan B, but allow a provider to test this technology, go with pilots and make sure that you manage the delegates' expectation. Like, hey guys, we're going to try something new. We're going to be the first company in the world that does live facial recognition checking. It might mess up, it will probably mess up, but then you manage the expectations of the delegate. Oh, well, I want to try this. I want to see, and that's how you can learn and that's how we can learn also. Where do you put the cameras? How do you set it up? How do you speed up the process? Where does it add value? Does it add value or it's just a gimmick? So make sure that you manage the whole process of introducing new technology, asking the right questions to the delegate, learning from it, and see how it can deliver value for every stakeholder within the event. So trial and error, we spent like 16 months before we got the facial recognition really ready and working as we wanted it. And we're still tweaking and improving some aspects of the plan. So we've done about 30 live events, the biggest one being up to 20,000 delegates, and with an accuracy of 99.7%. So we're getting more and more experienced in that domain. One of the new things we're introducing is, we showed it last week at Event Tech Live. This is Fielda, our virtual assistant. And she recognizes you through facial recognition and then gives you a personal welcome message. So this can be like, hey Danny, you're a speaker, go to the speaker ready room, your next session is at 3:30 and have a coffee. So we're now investigating how can we use this virtual assistant in the event to actually deliver value and become like an information point, check-in system, check-in assistant. So we're experimenting with this AI and virtual assistant on the event. So again, we're going to do trials, we're going to do pilots and see how we can move this technology forward. We're also experimenting with access control with Microsoft HoloLens. It's sort of mixed reality. So you see the real world and then you have a screen in front where you see all the delegates. So you can actually overlay data and you can say, I don't think you're supposed to be here because it flags you red. Or you can say, and then again, how is technology adapted? There's a whole discussion going on now with facial recognition in the real world life. How is technology being used to the advantage of the organizer? And how is facial recognition being used in the public domain? If you go to China, there's no privacy. I was in China a few weeks ago, you too, Mireia. You see there's cameras everywhere. You go to the airport, you get scanned, and they know where you are at all times. So this luckily doesn't happen in Europe. But if you go to London, you're scanned by cameras, and they have an inaccuracy of 99.7% of mismatches, because the data is like millions of people with millions of profiles, and they have to match up the recognition. So there's a lot of room for errors there. We are matching like one delegate, verifying with the data of maybe 10, 20, 100,000 delegates, so it's limited. So that's why the accuracy is very, very high. And then rule number 6, if you're adopting technology, if it implements hardware and staff, make sure that you have covered your grounds. It's great if your event moves from one continent to another year after year and you adopt technology in Europe and say, oh, we're introducing something amazing here. And then next year, your event is in the US or in Singapore, and they have to drag all the staff and the equipment and the logistics over there to have the same delegate experience. So make sure that your equipment, that the provider you're working with can provide the same experience and the same level of experience in different regions where you're working. Questions? Slido. An API is not an API. Yep. An API, whose question is that? An anonymous question. Oh, so it's you. An API is not an API. An API is actually a way for two applications to talk to each other. So, but it's two-way. So I can have a registration, and as soon as somebody registers, I push the data to the kiosk or to the mobile app, and there it's going to be used for its own purpose. If a supplier says he has an API, make sure that you see what data is being transformed. But it might be that it's just sending last name, first name, email address, and the company. That's also an API, but it just sends 4 fields. It doesn't send the workshops, it doesn't send networking data, it doesn't send other information. So it's not because a supplier says we have an API. We've seen a lot of suppliers that have an API, but basically you need to start building up from scratch, and that's where the cost comes in. Once you start defining your objectives and start like, but we need the sessions to come in, and when somebody registers in a mobile app for a session, it also needs to push back to the registration system because we want to know who registered for that specific session. So it's a two-way, bidirectional integration that needs to be tested and well documented before you jump into the bath and say, they both have an API, it will work. So don't assume. That's why an API is not an API. There's only one question. Okay. We're a SaaS service, and we call the hardware a necessary evil. You need printers to print badges. Unfortunately, you need scanners to do access control. You need hardware and virtual. So yes, we have equipment. You can purchase the equipment. You can rent it for us. We have plenty of warehouses around the globe, so we can provide a consistent service throughout different regions. And you can choose to use your own kiosks. You can even choose to buy your own printers. But sometimes it doesn't make sense to have a supplier in Brazil buy Epson printers, because if we ship them to Brazil, they would pay like 35–40% taxes on the equipment if it comes from Europe. So for us, hardware is not the money, it's not the revenue maker. The hardware is just there to serve the purpose, and whatever hardware you're using, we will be helping you to implement it and to make sure that you can use it on your event and that it's consistent with the standards. Another question? That's all? That's all, folks. Thank you.